Hi, I'm Greg Farrar, and this is my COVID-19 Trends live stream. It has been a while. I think the last one I did was something like 10 days ago. The main reason I haven't done them is because my main data source dried up. It was the one that I've been using for state and county information, just suddenly stopped reporting data at the end of last month, the end of August. So I didn't have any data for September. And I've kind of just let that slide because I wasn't sure that anyone was actually really going to miss this live stream if it disappeared. But it appears people will miss this live stream if it disappears. And so I've gotten enough feedback saying, when are you going to do the next one, that I'm going to do another one, and maybe another and another. So I went and tracked down the people who make that data stream and found out that for unknown reasons there's some sort of a glitch in their pipeline that's preventing it from the data from making it to their website, but there's another way I can get it. So now I'm getting it the other way, and I now have new data, which is fun because I also use this data set multiple times a day. I'm somewhat obsessed, and so I tune into my own website all the time to just see what's the news and everywhere. And so I've been a little depressed not being able to find out the latest news from Marin County or whatever. And now I can. So I guess thank you for everyone who said, no, please keep doing this. So I will. Not daily, I'm sure. That's probably not going to happen, but at least weekly, hopefully, I'll keep doing this. And I hope to do another blog as well one of these days to get this in written format. Anyway, let's dive in. Let's see. I'm going to take a quick pop over to my live stream and make sure that I'm actually streaming. I am live, it says. Great. Okay, so I will start as I do with the countries and then go to the states and then to the counties of California. 3 segments, about 20 minutes each is typically how it works. Maybe 15 minutes each. I'll start with my severity metric, which is a combination of the daily cases per million, which is the daily cases adjusted by population, and the growth rate. So roughly speaking, severity is my attempt to show in a single graph how are the countries of the world looking compared to each other. Are they getting better or worse? Now, there certainly have been worse times in the world than right now, but that said, things aren't that great in the world graphs. I think we'll see later that the states of the United States and the counties of California actually look better than the world right now, which was certainly not the case in July, when the world was terrible, and when the United States was terrible, and California was not great, and the world was looking generally pretty good. If we look over the period being examined here, which is about a month, I guess? No, 2 months. September, July, August, September, yeah, something like 2 months. It's kind of stable. These countries, these are just the worst ones in severity. They're stable at maybe around 150 or 200. Now, we don't have any really bad ones, but Israel and Bahrain, which has always been one of our worst ones, is really still up there in a fairly terrible way. Qatar, always its friend, its neighbor. I'll look at Qatar for a minute. It's not showing up in our top 20. So Qatar, I think, is just a fine example of a country that really had it really, really bad. It was certainly the worst. Nearly 1,000 in severity. And now it's down to 70, where I think of 100 as pretty good. If you can get below 100, you're doing okay. If you can get below 50, you're really doing okay. Get below 15 or so, you're kind of done usually. Though, as we'll see, Spain, there are examples where that's not the case. So again, about the severely hit countries, only 4 of them that are hot spots. No, actually, there are 6. So Israel, Bahrain, Argentina, part of the Central South America cluster. By the way, the roosters and the chickens here do not know what to do because it is clearly the end times looking at the sky. We're in nuclear winter here in California. The sky is a horrible red. It's dark at 3 p.m. and the chickens just don't know what to make of it. So they won't shut up. You'll be hearing a lot from them today. That is their comment on the fires. not on COVID. The fires are the fourth apocalypse, I guess, of 2020 or something. And so we see Spain, alarmingly and bizarrely, I might even say, maybe not that bizarre, but Spain is really taking its own trajectory now. As we can see at the very beginning of this graph, Spain was down at 10 severity, and as I mentioned, 15 usually means you're golden. You've totally gotten over this thing. But Spain, this little pink line, has gradually risen, and now it's actually a hot spot, and it has been for some weeks. So Spain is really bad right now. And I think there's some other, it's not Italy, France, I think. I'll flash France here. France also, of the European contingent, was doing really well, and now France and Spain have risen into the top 20 in severity, which is strange. But still, Central South America is the epicenter. We have a real smattering of places. Bahrain, certainly not either of those. Israel, then we have the Middle East to represent. We have, well, Hungary kind of counts as, we never know whether to count Hungary as Europe, but it too is following this trajectory from being, and I don't think it was ever high. Like, I don't know that Hungary ever really got it. At least it seems to have been essentially zero for the whole time we're tracking here. Let's see, do we go further back? We do. Let's just look at Hungary. And actually, I'm going to figure out, because I get to be completely geographically illiterate in my normal life. But here I should probably know whether Hungary is really part of Europe. And yes, Hungary is part of Europe, for those who are wondering. I guess it's Turkey that's the real question. Hungary, definitely part of Europe. And Hungary is, it's just never had the disease since the very beginning. But now look at it. So something's happening in Europe very recently. Europe is going hog wild in some sort of a new wave of the virus. We've got at least Spain, France, and now Hungary shooting up into at least the warm spot range, and indeed the hot spot range. Now, that said, we have nobody in the Qatar. This isn't Qatar. Where's Qatar? Oh, it's because Qatar is not in the top 20. This is just the top 20. We have no one in the high hundreds range that we've occasionally seen from Qatar, and even among the current top 20, some of those were in the much higher hundreds than we have now. But we do see Israel and Bahrain certainly going in a bad direction, and a lot of these are headed upwards. So there's something that looks like it might be a new world wave coming. The worst ones in the world are heading upwards. If we look at all of the world, do we see the same thing? Well, it's kind of hard to say. Here again, no one's over 500, so there aren't any extraordinarily bad ones, but we still have Israel, Bahrain, the top 20s we've already looked at. But just worth noting, there are a whole lot of countries that are not even warm spots, most of them. We have 10 warm spots and 5 or so hot spots, and then the rest of them are okay. I will take a moment to look at India. Actually, let's look at the United States. Let's compare the United States with India. And we look at the United States. Is this the United States? I guess it is. So the United States, it doesn't look like the graph that I'm used to seeing for the United States, so I'm a little confused by this graph. But in any case, there's a missing peak back in the history of this, so maybe it has something to do with how far we're not going back far enough. I think that is what's going on. I think I'd like to have these go all the way back. Now that I have these smooth line graphs, I can get away with that. When I was drawing a dot for every day, my graphing library couldn't cope with the whole history. But do we go back further for some of these other ones? Yeah, all right. Let's look at these. And I've been looking at severity, but I'm going to switch over now to daily cases per million. Daily cases per million still lets us compare countries. Let's just see where they actually are, but it doesn't give any kind of weight to which direction they're trending like severity does. So we can have a country that's really high, and even if it's rapidly, or if the growth rate is shrinking, it'll still show up near the top of this list. These are the worst states in daily cases per million. Notice that India isn't here. And for months, I've been saying, well, India has the potential to be a problem, but it just doesn't have any cases compared to its population, so we're not going to pay much attention to it. As we'll see, India is starting to move into the category where we're going to have to pay some attention to it. So here's the United States with its double hump. This is the April peak. I first started this podcast because I saw this peak coming and it didn't seem like the news was talking about it. Live stream, I should call it, I guess. And I wanted to say, hey, look, things aren't so bad. Look, the United States is going to peak. And indeed it did. But then it lost it horrifically in July. But again, and we followed it all the way up. Those were sad days when the United States and all the states were just on fire. But again, we saw a peak coming, and it has happened late July. And the whole month of August has been very nicely downward, and September continues this. Now, just a few days ago, I was getting kind of worried, if we zoom in on this graph a little bit, because there was a sense that I was seeing that it was flattening out. And indeed, the growth percentages were negative, but they were getting smaller and smaller negative. In other words, they used to be 7% drop every week, and then they were 5% drop every week, and then they were 3% drop every week. And it seemed like they were trending in a direction we'd see on the growth curve. Actually, maybe we can see it on the growth curve. It seemed like we were trending in a bad direction for the United States. Weekly growth, United States. Yeah, and you can see it just a little bit here. I'll zoom way in. There was a period the United States was consistently doing 10% drop every week, which is great. If we can hold that, as you'll see, that graph will just keep heading downward, and we'll have fewer and fewer cases. And even if we do have another wave, which I actually don't really expect, for a variety of reasons, you can read my Medium article to read up a little bit on that, but I've talked about that a lot already. But even if we do have a second wave, if we can get down into the teens or something in daily cases per million, then our second wave might look more like Spain's second wave, where at least we don't shoot sky high from a very large number. We have a lot of runway to grow and grow and grow and see it coming and still recover without even becoming a hot spot again. And so this is great. And then we started to see this, and it was starting to look like maybe in the next few days we were going to cross zero again, and we were going to see the United States growing again. I'm pleased to say that for several days now, we're showing more of a downward trend in our growth direction. We're still around 5%, but it's getting a little bit stronger, at least isn't following this trend that seemed to suggest the United States was heading back towards growth. Now, that said, we did just have Labor Day, and Memorial Day kind of killed us, so maybe Labor Day will too, literally. And we also have the schools opening, though a lot of them are cautiously not opening or unopening. And so we will continue to see. We'll see what happens there. We'll continue to watch what's going to happen with those. Those are major factors. And we have winter coming, which may drive people indoors and might also be a factor that will cause this to rise. But for now, in spite of schools having opened in many places, maybe this little ramp was because of schools. Maybe this little flattening out is because of the schools reclosing. I don't know. There are a lot of factors that go into it. But at this point, we're still seeing the United States heading in the right direction. It's still below zero. It's still shrinking. So when we go back to where we were, this is a really nice graph for the United States. Now, worth noting, we're still a warm spot. We're still at 120 daily cases per million. Until we're under 100, we can't even say that there's not a problem, but it's kind of a bad problem above 100. And it's a really bad problem above 200, a hot spot. The United States barely ever got there. Lots of countries have done worse than this, but certain states like Arizona and Florida really did badly. They were in the 600s or something, and Rhode Island. But as a whole, the United States continuing to trend downward, maybe faltering a little bit, but still the trend continues. And in the short term, the very short term, it's back at about the slope it was. It had this little attempt to plateau, and now it's heading back downward. So good news for the United States. If we look at all the other ones, the news is not so good. As we've seen, there seems to be a trend for the world as a whole, upwards. The hardest hit countries, at least, seem to be going upwards. There are a few exceptions. The Colombia, for instance, part of the Central South America cluster, is showing a downward trend. The United States is showing a downward trend. And I thought there was one other. What is this? Peru, also part of the Central South America cluster. Let's just zoom in and just the good news here for a minute. Peru, Colombia, and the United States, part of the Americas cluster, all looking quite good. And I thought Brazil was okay. Yeah, Brazil actually also kind of belongs here. Brazil had a fake peak right around here, and then rose again sharply but briefly, and has been pretty much been going down since then. So the news is good for the hardest hit countries. Brazil, United States, the news is good. But let's go back to, I think we actually have to look at some of my older graphs to really get this. Yeah, it's going to be hard to see because it's messing it up, which is why they're my older graphs. I stopped using these because they kept losing their lines. We don't see the trend lines here because the graph's broken for some mysterious reason, but we can certainly see the United States is one of the highest, has the highest cases in the world. Let's see if we can fit Brazil in here and have it somewhat intelligible. Not so much, but we definitely can see, here's the United States. It was around 70,000, even 80,000 a day, new cases, and now it's dropped into the 30s or the 20s. That's a really solid drop of newly daily cases since its peak. But here's India. And India, which was in the 20s, has switched places with the United States, and now it's in the most recent case, day 95,000 cases. So India is now having more cases than the United States ever had. It's having more cases than Brazil ever had. India, in raw cases, is the world leader for the coronavirus now. Not exactly the sort of thing you want to win a Nobel Prize for, or whatever sort of prize you'd win for that sort of thing. A gold medal at the coronavirus Olympics. The United States, or the India is in first place. The reason India still doesn't show up, though, is because relative to its population, which is a billion, 1.3 maybe, 1.3, 1.4, 1.4 billion people in India. This isn't that many cases relative to the population, and in fact is fewer cases than the United States or Brazil relative to their population, because they're a quarter of the population or a fifth of the population of India. And so these numbers actually, in my normal graphs, I adjust for population. They get magnified to the point that you're seeing the population per capita, or the cases per capita. And so when you look in my usual graphs, here's India looking very bad in trend line, but compared to the United States, it's starting to be in the same ballpark, but still much below. The United States peaked above 200 daily cases per million, my favorite metric, daily cases per million. But India is still only at 60. So even though they have more cases than any other country, by a long shot now, in daily cases per million, they're still relatively low, and they're not even a warm spot by my usual metric. Now, it doesn't take too long at this sort of rate to hit 100 or 200. So we'll see what happens to them. Will they peak below 100? Will they peak below 200? With their population, if they get to 200, they're going to have an extraordinary number of cases. They're going to completely dominate the world cases. But so far, they still have runway. They still have a chance to get this thing under control before they get into even the warm spot range. Okay, that's probably enough about countries. I will show, though, let's see. Can we see the whole world trajectory? Because this is kind of different than it's been. A world trajectory and growth. So the world is flat in growth. The United States and Brazil, biggest contributors, are dropping, but India is coming on, and we saw all those other countries, all the other ones that are just starting to heat up as well. They're canceling each other out. And so though there was a period, when the world growth was a 0.5%. Still not super high, but it dropped down and down and down, mostly thanks to the United States getting over it, and maybe Brazil a little bit, till it was about at zero. And actually, many of these days were below zero. So arguably, the world growth was dropping. World cases were dropping daily. But now we see it's really lost that trend, and there's a new trend upwards. The line here is starting to indicate. And we can say the world is growing by maybe 1/4 or 1/5 of a percentage every day on average. It's a surprisingly low number there. I'm not sure I quite believe that number, that 3% for the latest rolling average of 7 days. But maybe. But even if that's not true, certainly some of the latest days are low, so maybe we're starting to see a little bit of recovery. But all it takes is India keeping its trajectory on. It single-handedly will make the world rise, make this graph rise in weeks to come if it doesn't peak and decline. Everyone peaks and declines. The only question is when. And we don't know how India's going to go. I haven't paid a lot of attention to what they're doing there in India. But I can say that all these months of saying India is not a big deal have come to an end. India is now a big deal. The question is, how big a deal is it going to become? So let's move on to the states of the United States. Aw, snap, my browser says. I hope it'll let me reload that. So these are the reports that for the longest time have been unavailable to me. Well, it seems like forever. It was really only a couple weeks. But I did finally figure out what was going wrong from a data perspective. My data source is still broken, but I found a way around it. And so this is the same data source. I'm just getting in through a back door to grab this data. So when you look at the states of the United States, well, first of all, let's take a look. Guam, extraordinarily bad at 2,000 severity, has now gotten down to 300. Still a hot spot, but really showing a solid recovery. South Dakota, I believe in my Medium article, I originally said there were about 4 states that hadn't had a wave yet, and that we could expect to be a very small 4th wave. I know one of them was Hawaii. I think one of them was actually Maine, but I'm not sure I believe that, because I think Maine, there's something weird about the Maine data. Like either it's never had any cases to begin with, which would be odd, or the data just isn't being reported properly through this source. But South Dakota, I'm guessing, was one of those we never had a wave states. If we look back, actually let's look at South Dakota from a daily cases per million perspective. South Dakota, still it's the very top, South Dakota and Guam, in daily cases per million, both hot spots. Not super hot, they're 200, 300 range. Hot spot is 200 or above, but there's South Dakota. It barely hit above 100, so according to my traditional definition of did you have a wave, it did back in April. Kind of like, reminds me of Louisiana, actually. Well, Louisiana really had a wave. No, that's not who it reminds me of. There are a couple of states that flirted with 100 and then dropped away, but never really dropped away. And Louisiana was kind of like that. It went briefly quite high, and then it dropped away to below 100. And then it had what seems to be its real wave. It looks to me, broadly speaking, like South Dakota is finally having its real wave. It just hasn't been on our radar. It's never been very high. It was barely a warm spot, and then it wasn't for a long time. But now it's a hot spot, and it's one of the hottest spots in the country. So everyone gets it eventually. South Dakota, it's your turn. On the other hand, if we ignore Guam, which certainly has had its problems but seems to be getting better, and South Dakota, which arguably is still having a problem, though it's got a little bit of a hook here that maybe shows that it's getting better. Ignoring those, the trend is certainly that the July wave has died away. Florida, Arizona, all of those really hard-hit July wave states have gotten a lot better. And this is why the United States has gotten a lot better, because it was very hard hit in the first wave with New York, and it got a little bit better as New York and friends, New Jersey and nearby, got better. And there was a wave in May that kind of got lost in the noise because it was never that big. You can see one of them was Nebraska, was part of the May wave, and still is a little bit problematic. It's never quite gotten over it. Where is Nebraska here? Yeah, Nebraska, it definitely never recovered. Recovery, well, I've sometimes said that under 100 is recovery, but I'm definitely getting the sense that we see a lot of states that if they don't get low, like let's look at New York, what does it look like to actually recover? Well, New York, you get a really high number, like 400 daily cases per million, really hard hit. Recovery, in the case of New York, New York recovered and went below 50 daily cases per million. Now, I don't think of a state as really having recovered until it gets down to about 15. So even New York is still fighting. It's like, they got the cold, and a month later, they're still fighting it off, or in this case, months and months later, they're still fighting off that same cold. They haven't certainly not eradicated it. I mean, the fact that they're not zero means they haven't eradicated it. We know there are new cases in New York every day, and there have been for a long time, and they can't quite lick it. But nevertheless, they are still kind of a poster child for as good as it gets in the United States. New York, New Jersey, this is what it looks like when you have the COVID-19 in your region. You get over it, and no one ever recovers. And I think because there's still a kind of cross-pollination happening here. The different, what do they call it in the field, epidemiology field, like chambers or something like that. The different chambers cross-transmit. So as long as you've got some place that's really got it bad with 200 or 300, and as long as you're letting them fly into New York City, JFK, then you're going to continue to have a low-level transmission from all the people coming from Arizona and so on. So anyway, Nebraska, I don't know what to say about Nebraska. They're except that they're still a warm spot, and they have been for a very long time, and they've never really gotten hot. I don't remember why we ever even started talking about Nebraska. I guess it's because they were, of the top 20 today, they're one of the few ones that are from the May wave. And then there's Louisiana, which was another one of the ones that kind of breaks the simple pattern of New York, where they got it bad, they mostly recovered, but never really. And then they had what I would say is arguably their real wave, along with the rest of July, and they still haven't recovered. They've gotten a lot better, but look, they've plateaued now. And so we still have this passing back and forth between regions. Now, what I expect to happen eventually is most regions will be immune, maybe even biologically, but more they'll be immune in that they've had it, and they've all learned to wear masks, which seems to be very effective, and they'll keep doing those things. Or at least they'll be ready to pull their mask right out of their backpack again if they ever start to feel like their region is getting it again. In Louisiana, by the way, I think I mentioned, this is New Orleans, and this is not New Orleans. So Louisiana kind of functioned as two different regions, where New Orleans got it, but the rest of the state didn't, and then later the rest of the state got it. All right, but if you look at Florida, for instance, this is quite a nice graph. Florida in Arizona. Arizona? Really? Well, that's interesting and very good news as well. Let me show you Arizona here. The fact that they're not in the top 20 is fascinating. We've kind of seen this coming because Arizona has had such a good recovery. They had such a problem. But Arizona, very hard hit, certainly one of the worst, over 500 in daily cases per million in July, along with Florida. Both of them have recovered, but Arizona's done it better. Arizona is not a warm spot, hasn't been for a while. It's certainly not down into that sort of safe zone below 50, but it is down below 100. Now, again, they're also plateauing a little bit, but they're so low now that they don't even show up in the top 20 in terms of daily cases per million. So that is a metaphor almost for I don't know, it's the single case, the single state is moving in a way that exemplifies the country as a whole, where we saw a whole lot of activity in July, almost all of it dramatically shrunk by now. And this is why the United States is looking good now. But even though we're much off our peak, we're still centered, I'd say, around that 200 line. There are some, in the top 20, there are some hot spots and there are some warm spots. And the fact that the coolest of the top 20 is at 130 or something suggests that there are probably some other warm spots. We could find them on this graph if we were to look. There are other warm spots. In other words, there are more than 20 warm spots or hot spots in the nation. So, looking at the whole graph here, things are better for sure, but things are not good by any means. Good would be, I would start to use the word good if all the states, or all except a few wild outliers, were below 100. But we have a lot of warm spots still. We have a few hot spots. So we're not good yet. Certainly not time to relax. But you look at something like, let me just pick out a couple of these, like Oklahoma. Now, Oklahoma is not a good example. Oklahoma is actually rising. It was sort of part of late to the July party. Oklahoma is still in a problem spot. So there's one that isn't. Actually, let's just go through all the top 20. South Dakota, not looking good. Guam, not looking good. Alabama, though, is broadly looking good. Short term, it's turning downward. Longish term, it's turning downward. Medium term, it's kind of flat. We'll keep that one. Missouri, at least, has flattened out. Tennessee is looking good. Oklahoma, that's, I think, the one that I picked earlier. Medium term, it's down, but it might be headed upward. I'll keep it anyway as one that at least shows a medium term trend off its peak, even though the short term isn't so good. Mississippi is great. Kansas is not good, so the ones I'm leaving out are the bad ones. South Carolina also showing a little bit of something to be worried about, but the long-term trend is good. I don't know what's up with Kentucky. That's probably bad data or infrequently reported data or something. Nebraska, probably it's flat at least. Louisiana, we saw, what is Louisiana? It's the purple. Yeah, very good. Maybe a little bit of a plateau. Broadly, the picture we're seeing is that we're heading downward from the peak, but there's some things to be worried about in the past couple weeks. It feels like we're probably not going upward again, but we're indicating a plateau. And yeah, that's kind of what I was talking about on the last slide, which is to say, the United States had this really nice downward trend, and it's faltered. It's faltered, but not gone up yet again. But there's some evidence that it's plateauing and losing its downward momentum. The worst hit ones, some of them are still pretty steady downward, but quite a number of them are showing this horizontal, or even, as in the case of Oklahoma, slightly upward trend. Now there's Idaho doing nicely. North Carolina is doing pretty well. Hawaii, which was a little bit hard hit, is starting to show a trend downward. At least its long-term trend is upwards, I think, but the medium term is looking like a plateau, and the short term is headed downwards. Wisconsin, at least flat. Minnesota, slightly upwards, flat. Short term, slightly downward. Texas is looking better, definitely, and so is Nevada. So most of these states, of the top 20, are looking good, I would say. Looking better. They're getting better. They're not looking good yet, but they're getting better. And then maybe half of them, it's not at all clear that they're getting better. So mixed bag, but at least we can see the clear trend in this graph is from a really bad July to a much better August at this point. August is much better than July in terms of daily cases per million, with the wild exceptions of, really, even these aren't as bad as Guam and South Dakota still aren't as bad as July, and some indication those are getting better. So the states improving, still improving, but maybe not improving as much as they have been improving. I think I will Well, no, let's look at the growth rates, because this is another way of looking at the same thing. But maybe this is another one of my favorite graphs. Of those top 20, which direction are they actually heading? I was kind of eyeballing this just now, but this graph will tell us numerically. Some of the states are shrinking. Anyone below the bright white zero line is a state that is shrinking in daily cases. Some of them are growing, but Guam and South Dakota, the ones that were hard hit, are sharply heading downward in their daily growth rates, in their daily or weekly growth rates. And so these are getting better fast. The maybe troubling, so these aren't actually, we shouldn't be too worried about these. These seem to be, though they have a high number of cases, they're getting better. The more troubling thing is how many of these lines seem to be slightly above zero and roughly horizontal, like Kansas or Oklahoma or South Carolina or even Wisconsin, which seems to be actually trending upwards. There are a few states that are growing at a 10% rate, not huge. I don't usually worry unless it's 20%. These are every week. But still, they're growing. And they're not clearly getting better in their growth rate. Their growth rates are not shrinking. Not too many of those, though. So I guess I'd say mostly the news is good in this graph. There are three kinds of good we can see here. Now, two kinds of good. One kind of good is they're shrinking. They're actively shrinking. And by the way, they're not shrinking but heading towards zero. They're shrinking and staying there. So good. The other kind of good is their growth rate is rapidly shrinking. So even though they're high in growth rate, like South Dakota here at 30% weekly growth, they're shrinking so rapidly that it's just a matter of days until they'll probably join this pack as actually shrinking. Not just the growth rate shrinking, but the daily cases shrinking. And then there are just a handful, maybe 5 or 6, that aren't doing that. And by the way, this one here is another example of this. Alabama and North Carolina here. A little hard to see. Let me zoom in a little. But those actually have the same kind of good news, which is to say, this purple line and this brown line, though they're growing or have been growing, they're pretty much heading to zero, and they're heading downwards, just like Guam, which has actually turned the corner at this point, crossed zero, and can now be expected to shrink every day. Alabama and North Carolina also doing that. So it's really just these, oops, well, I didn't, kind of accidentally zoomed in on the thing I wanted to zoom in on. Okay, just these 6, Missouri, Kansas, South Dakota, Minnesota, Oklahoma, and Wisconsin. These are the ones that are actually don't have great news. They're not terrible because their growth rates aren't above 20%, but they're not quickly getting better. Now these 3 are getting better. Kansas, South Carolina, and Minnesota are heading towards zero, but they're heading at a slow enough pace that it would probably be weeks until they get there. Oklahoma isn't doing that at all, and in Missouri it's flat, and Missouri and Wisconsin are this is exactly what we don't want to see in a graph, especially Wisconsin, which is to say a positive growth rate and a growing growth rate. These are experiencing exponential growth, but these are really the only ones that are, and even Missouri is just very slight. In Wisconsin, yes, it's growing and the growth rate is growing, but it's only at 8%. That's 1% a day, 8% a week. And so it's not in a terrible state either. So there's just no really bad news among the states here. Bottom line, the states are doing well. There are no really hard hit states. We're seeing a general trend towards recovery. Maybe we're seeing a very short-term trend towards stasis, where we're not going to be recovering, where we're just going to be flat at this certain growth rate. But that's a lot better than it was in July. We were not in stasis in July. We were having a terrible growth epidemic in July. So that's good. Should I look at any of these? Briefly, just to say, yes, death rates have also been dropping. You can see it. I'm not going to spend a lot of time there. Let's see what we can see about testing. Percentage tested. As always, it's all the states are continuing to test more and more. They're all they're all testing steadily. If we look at this, I don't like this graph that much anymore, but we can see the lines on this graph headed upwards, which means that the number tested daily is rising. Anyone above about, what was it, 0.15, I think, is roughly the number we say they're doing really well. Almost all the states are doing well in testing, and almost all of them are rising. They're doing better and better as it goes along. If we look, there are a few. Arizona, interestingly, is shrinking in testing, and a few others. Florida, and those were the hard hit ones of the July wave. Those two, I can only assume that there was something about being incredibly hard hit, where they just were testing madly, sending tests out of state, testing madly, and they're probably still testing just fine. It's just that the rate is dropping, but maybe not. Maybe they're getting complacent. It's hard to imagine Arizona or Florida getting complacent at this point, though. So maybe this is some sort of a data trouble. Maybe they just couldn't keep up and the testing went really high. But I don't know. According to the numbers, Arizona testing less than 1/10% per day, which really isn't good enough. So hopefully that's not even true. But if it is, they should probably get back to where they were, because back in the middle of the epidemic, they were doing much better. Everyone else, though, they're testing at least 1/10%. Many of them are testing above 0.15. So mostly the testing is looking good. Let's move on. So the news is good for, well, the news is good in the sense of the trend, the direction is good. The news is not good for the states in the sense that we still have a huge number of warm spots and hot spots. So whatever we're doing is working, but we have some headwinds now in the form of school openings, in the form of winter coming on, and in the form of maybe Labor Day weekend. We'll see. It's too early to say what effect Labor Day weekend might have, but these headwinds just mean that we're going to have trends. We're going to have forces on our trend lines that are pushing them upwards. Those three things will tend to push our trend line upward. We can still keep the trend lines going downward as long as the forces pushing them downward are stronger. And those forces will be the usual, under the metaphorical immune system analogy, they'll be the usual things. There will be our antibodies in quotes, which are things like testing. As we see, testing is getting better. Oh, by the way, I now know from the news, I can tell you a secret. I was telling you that the Los Angeles School District was going to be opening up. I'm not sure that they really are letting students in person at this point, but they're trying, and they've got this plan to do an immense amount of testing. And I can tell you the secret that I've known for some time now, which is I've been involved, at least kind of in a sister company way or a child company way, with the company that's doing the testing for the Los Angeles School District. And we have this very cool robotic thing that just moves beakers and vials around and does testing at tens of thousands a day, or each robot can do that. Well, I suddenly am losing the name of the company, Bio something. Let's look it up. Los Angeles. All right, I'm not going to look it up. I'm not going to find it, but Summer Bio, I think that's it. Summer Bio, anyway, is doing this testing for Los Angeles County. That is the company that is making it possible for the largest school district, at least in the state and maybe even in the country, to open up by doing frenetic testing of everybody, 10% of the student body every month or something they're going to try to do. And so this sort of thing, and we're seeing all sorts of different testing technologies come online, from breathalyzer type testing to do it yourself, lick a piece of paper type testing, or maybe it's not a piece of paper, but almost testing that's close to the simplicity of a pregnancy test, where you pee on a stick and you see a positive, you're COVID-19 positive, and you see it in 15 minutes. all this stuff, there's been a mad effort across a whole bunch of startups and not so startups to crank up testing and make it faster and make it easier and maybe even make it at home. And so that is one of the forces that I think, one of the antibodies that we're developing, that's going to keep a lid on this thing in spite of the upward forces, or at least it's going to try. I don't know if it's going to keep a lid on it. The upward forces are of undetermined magnitude, and as we go into just the next few weeks, we're going to start to know the answer to this. I got pretty worried when I started to see all these things leveling out. Now that I start to see it heading back downwards again, I am starting to hope, though it's just a hope, that the forces driving the cases down in the United States are stronger than these oncoming things. But that's speculation, not to be read from my data. So anyway, Summer Bio, I'm proud to say I have some small part in, and it is the thing that is allowing the Los Angeles School District to open up, and if its robots can be quickly enough made and distributed, it'll be one of many, many companies that is making fast, cheap, quick turnaround testing possible, and that will that's going to help here. Now, the other thing that helps is masking. I would say, though some would disagree, but I would, as in my own analysis as a citizen scientist, I would say masking is effective, and I think the evidence is strong for that now. And if that's true, then the almost universal masking that I'm seeing is probably the reason that we're seeing these things go down. I think masking is probably the single reason why we're seeing these things go down. So I'll keep wearing my mask and keep avoiding groups and socially distancing when I can. There are certain things like flying that I do that are high risk, and I try to balance them out with basically locking myself in my room 24/7, or at least on my land. All right, moving on to the severity of California. So I actually reached out to today to the moderators or contributors of the Marin data, because no, I don't think so. We see these spikes sometimes, and sometimes they're data related just errors. Sometimes they're real. Like sometimes, like Imperial, this was real, but this was 2000, and that was extraordinary. Now the idea that Marin has suddenly spiked to 12,000 in severity, I don't think so. But I did look really deeply into this one, and I'm not going to go into the details, but I will say that Marin had 3,000 cases total, and suddenly one day jumped to 6,000, according to Corona Data Scraper, my source. And looking at other places, that doesn't seem to be the case. Looking at the Marin County website, they've kept going upwards, but they've risen from 3,000 to 3,100, 3,200. Around that period, they were supposedly spiking to 6,000. So I just think there's a data error, but it's a weird one if so, because they keep saying it's 6,000. It's as though it spiked to 6,000 and stayed there. And if they had just miswritten one day, then they would have suddenly dropped back to 3,000. But so anyway, I've asked the providers of the Marin data for Corona Data Scraper for clarification on this. I think I found an error in their data, but they may come back and say, well, no, actually, we get it from a different source, and that source was starting to count in a different way. That's usually where we see something like this, is when the counting starts happening in a different way, and they start saying, well, if they used to say, if the only cause of the disease was well, actually, the more common case, that's for deaths. I'm not going to get into that, but in the more common case, like what China did on February 11th or something, they started to count every presumed case as an actual case, even if they hadn't done the test. And maybe that's what Marin did in late July. Anyway, that's not real. I don't think it's real. But we'll see. If it is, well, even if it is, the good news is it went away. And that's another reason to think it wasn't real, is what really happened was there was a spike up to 6,000, and that made the growth rate seem astronomical for a while. And growth is a major component of this severity, and so the severity went astronomically high. Even now, as it starts to level off, it's leveling off at 600. because it has so many cases, according to Corona Data Scraper. But the growth rate's no longer high because it's still hovering around 6,000. All right, so we can kind of ignore Marin. I don't believe it. Here's Butte, I think it's pronounced, county. Also, this is probably more real. They had some sort of a anomaly as well, but it may be an actual anomaly in a number of cases. But where they used to be just a barely warm spot, they shot up into the 600s and now starting to level off. So this second worst one also looking better. Not sure what caused that. Our up-and-coming challenge is Kings, which has often been on the radar. Kings really had it bad, got a lot better, but here it is back at 400. And then Imperial also had it bad, got a lot better. Here it is back at 300. San Benito, Stanislaus. Those are our hot spots. And then the rest of these on this list are warm spots in terms of, actually they're not all warm spots. Most of them are 100 or above as the counties go. If we look at all the counties, we can see, well, one thing to take away from here is there aren't many hot spots out of the however many counties this is, 100 or something. We have, maybe it's only 70, 50? I'm not sure. I don't know how many counties there are in California. I should know this, but I don't. And but I do know that roughly the solid lines are the first 25 and the dotted lines are the next 25. So it's something like 50. So I guess there are 50 some. But I also do discard the very smallest ones because they move so erratically and they don't contribute to the total numbers very much. By the way, if you want to see the very smallest ones, those numbers are available at the New York Times website. That's where I've been turning lately when my own stats have been down. Unfortunately, it is paid. You have to subscribe, I think, to get access to that. But I do subscribe to them. That's one of my 2 subscriptions, New York Times and the Washington Times. I go for the 2 times and try to split the political spectrum evenly to get a good broad view of news. By the way, my other sources are Fox News, CNN, also an attempt to get a spectrum of news, and then Reuters, which I think lands exactly in the middle. So if I'm not looking for any sort of political lean, I go to Reuters. So anyway, the New York Times has some very good coronavirus stats, but so does Google. Google will also give you this information, and it's free there. So, Imperial. We've seen these already. Those 5 some are the hot spots. There are a fair number of warm spots, so there are quite a lot that aren't warm at all. Let's just focus though, because I'm already kind of running out of time. Let's go straight to the growth. Where are the hottest? What is the growth of the hottest counties in California? And let's look. And recall, if you're a long-time listener or just tuned in last month, there was this faux spike here where California got behind on its testing, technical difficulties, and suddenly reported a bunch. That spike was not real, but neither was the drop down from it. And around here, around the September, I guess, is when we started to get accurate data again from California. So ignore the spike, but believe this. What do we see here? Well, it's mixed. The news is kind of mixed. On the bright side, almost every single one of these counties in the top 20 is shrinking. They're all below the bright white 0 line. Almost all of them are shrinking. The exceptions we saw are Marin, which according to this has now turned the corner, but it was probably all garbage anyway. Butte, which has not turned the corner, but at least is heading there. But right now, Butte is the one that looks terrible. 40%, 45% growth rate is really bad. Sometimes when we see this sort of a peak, like you're looking at a pyramid, like a triangle, a straight line up, sharp point, straight line down, it's because there's just one weird data point. So I'm not sure I believe this either. One weird data point does result in this kind of peak, and normally we see stuff more like what you see at the back here, where it's a much smoother peak and wiggly and all that. So this is probably suspect as well. These ones, though, I don't think are suspect. Imperial and Kings, which are our royal pair of California counties that have kept making the news for us. They were really hard hit. They kind of got better. They were absolutely the worst, especially Imperial. And now they're back. They're the worst, except for these two probably anomalous ones. But they're only slightly bad right now. They do have everything we hate to see in a graph. Everything we hate to see in a graph is it's above zero, so it's growing, and it's accelerating upwards. So both of these are above zero and accelerating upwards, but they're only barely above zero. Recall that 20% is kind of a bad number. That's this line here above them. And neither of them are bad yet in growth rate, but they're accelerating. They're heading into higher and higher growth rates. So we'll keep an eye on those. So the two worst ones are probably anomalies, data anomalies, not even real. The two here are probably real, but they're not bad yet. And that leaves us with everyone else good. All of the top 20, the other 16 top 20 are good in the sense that they're shrinking. The only slightly worrisome thing about this is that they were shrinking more before. If you look back in early September, they were shrinking by an average of maybe 20%. And now they're shrinking by an average of maybe 15%. And there's a little bit of a trend upwards. Like if you look at this line here, the Yuba County, it was down at 34%, negative 30%, 4%, and now it's up to negative 10%. Still shrinking. California's still doing well, but is this an indicator that we're headed back into a new challenge? Maybe, or maybe it's just sort of something, a purely data problem because we had that testing reporting database problem that drove it way high and then drove it way low. And maybe this is some sort of a natural bounce, just a mathematical bounce back from having slammed so hard at the bottom that it now is heading back into where it really was anyway, and it was never that low to begin with. That is very, very likely, actually, in which case we don't need to worry at all. We are heading, what we're seeing are all the counties are roughly horizontal here, with a few exceptions and a few probably data anomalies. They're horizontal, but they're shrinking. They're holding steady at the rate they're shrinking at. What we'd really like to see is to see their shrinkage rate increasing. We'd like to see these lines headed downward. We don't see that on any one here, except this one, which is anomalous and positive. So it's not as good as it possibly could be, but there's not too much to complain about here. These are the counties of California. They are stable in their shrinkage. They're shrinking and they're stably shrinking, so good. California's doing well. And if you look at the big picture of all the counties, similar, very similar. Almost all the counties of California are shrinking. They're stably shrinking. They're holding on to whatever their current negative percentage rate of shrink is. And there are very few of them, just maybe 5, that are just slightly rising. And with the exception of, I guess, Imperial, I wouldn't say that any of these graphs looks bad. Maybe also this one. Who's this? San Diego is a little problematic. It doesn't have that many cases, or it would have shown up in this graph. But it is showing everything we hate to see, which is 10% weekly growth and rising, accelerating. So San Diego not looking so good, but not really alarming yet either, with a 10% weekly growth. All right, that's the news. Now that I have my data sources, I'll probably keep doing this periodically. It won't be daily, I don't think. My next edition might be a blog. You can find those on the website at gregfarrar.us. You can also find these graphs on the website at gregfarrar.us. They do, in theory, get updated every day, in spite of the past 10 days when they didn't. And so you can just tune in, look up your favorite country, region, or city. Country, state, or county. That's the news. I'm Greg Farrar. Thanks for listening and watching.